In the last lecture, we went through Irish energy trends, and in this lecture, we'll go through global energy trends, which are somewhat different. And the source of this lecture is the World Energy Outlook Report, which is generated by the International Energy Agency every year. The International Energy Agency, or IEA, is a global intergovernmental organization, much like the UN or the World Bank, which has member organizations as countries. So it was founded in 1974 as this intergovernmental organization, aiming to coordinate a response to the oil crisis in the 70s. Primarily, the countries were oil-consuming countries. And since then, the objective of the IEA has evolved to examine cooperation around the full spectrum of energy issues. So first of all countries, member countries, have reserve oil capacity so that they can release reserves if there's an oil shock, so if there's a shock to global oil supply. But they also do policy analysis, data dissemination, capacity building, and policy coordination. The three pillars of the organization are energy security, affordability, and sustainability. And they increasingly do work on climate change and energy access as well. And Dr. Fatih Birol is the executive director. Full disclosure, I worked there for 3 years, and so many of the slides in here were produced by my former colleagues, or myself included. So one of the main roles that the IEA plays in the global energy debate is the production of the annual World Energy Outlook Report. And that's really seen as one of the most authoritative projections and pieces of analysis on the global energy demand, where past energy demand has come from, where it's going in the future in different scenarios, depending on different approaches and policies that governments take. And the World Energy Outlook produces two main scenarios every year. They also produce a number of other scenarios. So the new policy scenario, or confusingly, the new reports are calling this the stated policies scenario. This looks at where global oil, gas, coal, renewables demand is going in the future given the current climate. So given all existing and planned policies and targets that different countries have signed up to, where the global economic outlook is going, and where oil supply, gas supply, and so on will take us to. So it's sort of like a business as usual. This is where current targets get us to. The second scenario there is called the Sustainable Development Scenario, and that's a scenario which meets the Paris Agreement on climate change and meets the UN goal of universal access to energy by 2030 and reduces air pollution. This lecture will focus on the new policy scenario. So what is the outlook for energy given existing policies as of 2018 at least, because we're focusing on the 2018 report. Another lecture later in this series will look at the Sustainable Development Scenario and look at what additionally is needed to reach that. So global total primary energy demand, in terms of millions of tons of oil equivalent, MTOE here, has grown from around 7 million tons of oil equivalent in 1980 to over 14 million tons in 2018. And that growth was spurred by population growth, economic growth, and increasing energy use per capita. That means that total primary energy demand grew by about 1.8% per year between in those times. And the strongest growing fuels were coal. Coal grew by about 2% per year. Gas here grew by the blue grew about 2.5% per year. Oil by 1% per year. Nuclear grew at about 3.5% per year. It's yellow. And bioenergy by about 1.8% per year. Other renewables, which includes wind and solar, is very tiny, but it has been growing very rapidly in the last number of years. So in 1980, this was the picture of the global energy mix. 43% there was oil, 25% coal, 17% gas, and by 2018 there the picture looked quite different. So same share of coal, but a lower share of oil because gas demand grew, and basically there was a more diverse energy mix in 2018 than in 1980. Different sorts of energy came on the market. Looking ahead then to 2040, what does the IEA see happen under existing policies and conditions? So firstly, in the new policy scenario, there's an extra 1.7 billion people in the world, according to UN projections, and mostly they're added to urban areas in developing economies, and that really pushes up global energy demand to 2040. But this increase in energy demand would be twice as much if it wasn't for efficiency improvements in the future. So the actual sort of final useful energy is much more than that. Interesting as well is that natural gas overtakes coal to be the second largest energy source in 2030. Coal flatlines here. And that's because of a flatlining in electricity generation, especially in developed countries. And that's because of the economies of gas, natural gas. The economies of that are increasing, and renewables are overtaking coal as well. There's higher share of wind and solar PV in the systems in the future. If we look then at the geography of energy demand, which countries are mainly demanding energy. This was the picture of energy demand by the major consumers in 2000. Here, the US was by far and away the highest energy consuming country in the year 2000, followed by the EU and then other emerging economies, China, Africa, Asia, and Middle East. So in 2000, more than 40% of global energy demand was in Europe and North America. But the picture, if we put that forward in the future, you can see that China has rapidly grown, and you can see other Asian countries, India and Southeast Asia, are also growing rapidly. So there's been a profound shift in energy consumption in Asia, led by China, but many other countries are growing the way as well. So Asia makes up half of the global growth in natural gas, 60% of the rise in wind and solar PV, and so on. And by 2040, if we accelerate that forward in the new policy scenario, we see that in 2000, 40% of the global demand was in Europe and North America and 20% in Asia. But by 2040, this situation is completely reversed. So Asia is really driving the recent rise in energy demand globally, and projected for that to be the case by 2040. Now, something very interesting happened in this past week. So China released a commitment to be a net zero energy system by 2060. And you can see from this why that is so important. So China is the real heavyweight of global energy consumption. So when China sneezes, the world tremors. So a net zero energy system for China is a very good thing for the climate. If we look which in terms of fuels, what fuels are rising and what's driving those things to 2040, if we divide that between advanced economies, those are, say, developed economies, and developing economies, or emerging ones like China, India, Asia, Africa, and so on, there will be a very strong push for renewables and nuclear in developing economies, but nuclear is actually on the wane in developed economies, especially as a reaction to the Fukushima energy disaster and the declining kind of economies of scale of nuclear. It's becoming more expensive. But renewables are really a driving force in the future global energy system. That has implications for all of the fossil fuels. So gas here won't rise as quickly in advanced economies as it has in the past, but in developing economies, gas is really a big powerhouse for industry, for power, and for other end uses which powers developing economies. Oil then is actually projected to peak and decline by in the 2030s. In advanced economies, the oil demand from cars is projected to decline. We've got increasing efficiencies in cars and the rise of EVs, electric vehicles, is projected to offset a lot of the oil demand in cars. But in developing economies, there's going to be the same thirst for mobility, the same thirst for petrochemicals. That means stuff, basically plastics and things like that. That's driving the demand for oil in the future. And then coal there is projected to be around flat, reducing coal use in advanced economies, but increasing coal use in developing economies there. Coal is cheap and it's reliable, and it's often an indigenous energy source. So there's still going to be sustainability concerns under the current projected energy mix. Here is the global electricity demand by region, and electricity is one of the driving forces of future energy demand and past energy demand as well. And the electricity sector is really experiencing a very dramatic transformation since its creation more than a century ago. So electricity is increasingly the fuel of choice for economies that are relying on lighter industrial sectors, services, digital technologies. Our economies are become very, very much digitized and electrified. Our transportation is being electrified. Heating and the rise in devices and telecommunication services are really driving the demand for electricity. Electricity demand has increased by about 70% from the year 2000, and all that has been driven by developing economies here in the sort of orangey brown shaded area. The power mix here between 2000 and 2017, actually, if you look at the share of fossil fuels in the power mix, it's been quite flat between 2000 and 2017. Oil has decreased. Oil is not a very good power generation fuel. It's been replaced by gas. But the share of low carbon, zero carbon renewables and nuclear in electricity generation has also been about flat. But basically nuclear is being offset by a rise in wind and solar PV. So there's been very strong policy supports for those technologies, strong targets in many countries as well. This is annual power generation capacity additions. So capacity is the amount of potential power output that a particular plant can provide. And here it's illustrative that wind and solar, the green here, in terms of renewables, are on the rise from 2010 to 2017. And actually in 2016, 2015, for the first time, capacity additions of renewables was greater than capacity additions of fossil fuels. That was a historical moment. Here again is electricity, and the historical electricity generation has increased very significantly since 2000. Again, the power mix has been relatively stable, but the carbon intensity, the grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour, has decreased fairly rapidly. So Ireland is about 350 down here, and to get to our 2030 targets, we'll need to get down to about here. So illustrates the challenge. So that we're facing. A few more there to share. So this illustrates the growth in annual total final consumption by fuel. And you'll remember that total final consumption is the types of fuels that are available for households, for transport, for industry, for services sectors to actually use. So that includes coal, oil, gas, electricity, district heating, renewables. And these, in the medium term future, all fuels are driving growth in total final consumption. Mainly oil, as I said, for cars, and electricity. But after that peak, the IEA projects that in the kind of late 2020s and 2030s, demand for oil will start reducing, and electricity will really take off, as well as renewables. And so the share of electricity in total final consumption is steadily rising. And more optimistic people who are ambitious about the rise in renewables, the rise in electrification, will say that this is quite pessimistic, or some commentators really see that global oil demand will peak and reduce much faster. And given the context of 2020, huge economic shock, reducing in transport, aviation, oil, some people think that the growth in oil demand will never return to growth, basically. So this is all just a scenario. This was made in 2018, and we don't know what the future will hold in reality, but we do know that electrification and renewables are very certainly on the rise. This gives the scale of power generation since 1980. So this is the fuel mix going into the power generation mix. Again, coal has been a steady share, and basically oil here has been replaced by gas, greater share of nuclear and renewables, much like the overall primary energy demand, more diversity and more low energy low emissions fuels. And in the future, what is driving electricity demand are many things, but mainly industrial motors, interestingly, in developing economies. So the industrial sector is driving electricity demand growth, but also a residential sector, space cooling. In hot countries, people will want air conditioning, much like we in Ireland, like heating, appliances, connected on small appliances like mobile phones and things. EVs is set to drive electricity demand and people gaining access to electricity as well. This chart serves to illustrate the reason that renewables have been on the rise so much. This illustrates the dollars per megawatt hour, the levelized cost of electricity for different technologies. You can see here that solar PV and wind have seen huge reductions in cost, and since 2017 they've even reduced even further. So in many regions, actually, solar PV and wind, onshore and offshore wind, are competitive with fossil fuels. That's because of very, very strong policy supports. Quickly then going to the transportation sector, cars, trucks, trains, planes has historically had very strong growth, 2% per annum, and in the future that strong growth is projected to abate somewhat, at growing at about 1% per year, and that's because of efficiency gains and switching from fossil fuels to electric vehicles. So there's no coal. We don't have much coal-fired trains anymore, and there's a 91% share of oil in the global transport mix. Most of the rest is either gas, so natural gas vehicles are commonplace in some countries, like India, and we have about 3.5% biofuel mix, with electricity coming in at about 1%. So electricity is projected to grow by about 7% in the future, but still only to be about 4% share of transport energy consumption by 2040. Which mode? So 76% of this is from road transport, and aviation and shipping are really accelerating and driving this very much. What about the future? So in 1980, if you looked at the global car stock, there were about 80 cars for every 1,000 people, or 8% of people in the world had a car. That's nearly doubled to 150, so 15% of people have a car now, and that's projected to rise to 225 per 1,000 by 2040. So that means that the number of cars themselves have risen from about 335 million to over a billion cars today, and projected to be over 2 billion cars in 2040. Then looking at the residential sector, the last significant end-use sector, and the total growth has been slower than transported, about 1.3% per year, and electricity is the main source of growth here. Many countries in the world don't actually need heating, and it's electricity that is driving cooling demand and appliances demand. Biofuels here, you might be surprised about. This is somewhat mislabeled. This should be biomass, because a large share of this is actually wood energy that's used for cooking in open fires. So half of households in developing countries don't have modern fuels for cooking. It's very inefficient, so that's why it comes up as a large share of total final consumption. Oil demand here is mainly for heating in colder regions like ours, and same gas is growing in many of those regions as a heating fuel. You can see there the coal has almost gone out and it's phased out as a heating fuel. Now, if we look at the future, about unlocking a different energy future, and this is where we get to, it's clear basically that this is not a sustainable energy future, right? This will mean no peaking in emissions. So this is global energy related emissions, and this is where the new policy scenario takes us. And this is a very stark, you remember the huge drop that we need to achieve to reach the Paris goals. This is just a business as usual, continuing as normal. So what do we need to do by 2040? So where are those emissions from? The biggest challenge here is that by 2040, half of these projected emissions are from existing facilities that are under construction. This is from buildings that are now fossil fuel plants, like coal plants and gas plants that are under construction or planned right now. They'll still exist in 2040. So we have locked into a high emissions scenario, but it means that all here is sort of flexible, and it's up for grabs. The Sustainable Development Scenario is a scenario which is projected to achieve the Paris Agreement goals, or at least takes us on a path to that, which means that you see here it gives us very little wiggle room. This hatched green area is how much room for extra emissions above the existing and planned construction that we have. So there's lots of wiggle room there. But coal-fired power plants are a huge part of that, and if we remove coal-fired power plants from this, then we've got increased room to maneuver. And this is what's behind an awful lot of the environmentalist sector. Their call to end coal-fired power generation, or else to replace coal-fired generation with carbon capture and storage, so like capturing the CO2 from the chimneys of coal power plants. So basically, the faster we get rid of coal, or unabated coal, the more room to maneuver we have in the Sustainable Development Scenario.